Hello, and welcome to the final session of the Symposium for Inclusive Philanthropy, presented virtually by Unfunded List. We are going to talk giving circles in 2023 and beyond with two Giving Circle veterans who are no strangers to Unfunded List. You were both featured in season 4 of the podcast about collaborative giving and are serving as evaluators and also committee members helping out the finalist organization, while also with deep involvement in the Giving Circle world. Giving Circle world. Giving Circle world. It's a tough one. Should practice that earlier. Anyway, I also have some experience in the Giving Circle world. Nailed it. I was on the board of an organization called Slingshot Fund for a while, which used to have a giving circle, but no longer does. And I facilitated youth giving circles through some Jewish organizations for a while, which was a lot of fun to do. I worked like they would get their bar mitzvah money, pool that together, do there, and like usually as you do your bar mitzvah, you also have to do like a project, some sort of charity endeavor, right? And the Giving Circle was right part of that. It was pretty neat to work with them, teach them about philanthropy and everything, and that was kind of formative for me with the funded list. So was my time with Slingshot Fund, and we have reviewed quite a few submissions to Giving Circles as well through Unfunded List. So there's lots of connections and lots going on in the world of philanthropy. Giving Circles are like a trendy topic, top 10 trend certainly, and there's some people aggressively trying to make it trendier. And we're gonna dive into that, but first, more from our panelists. I'd love to have you each. Sometimes I introduce guests, but I've been introducing a lot of guests this week, so I'm gonna let you both do it. Talk to us about your. We'll go ladies first.
So just about me?
Yeah, just introduce yourself, including your career, your involvement with philanthropy, and in particular, your involvement in Giving Circles.
Okay. So actually, I started out in life as a journalist for a daily newspaper, but I got lured away to the nonprofit sector. And this was back when there were only about 30,000 nonprofits in America. I quickly fell in love with the nonprofit sector because I liked the grassroots community-based concept, and believe it or not, I loved fundraising. So I started out working for a consulting firm initially that was working with schools, healthcare, and arts organizations. Then I went on to be an employee at nonprofits. But I decided I wanted to leave the southeastern United States, where I'd lived all my life. And so I ended up coming to Washington, D.C. to go into the Foreign Service. So I became a U.S. diplomat, left the whole world of nonprofits and philanthropy, became an economics officer with a specialty in petroleum, went overseas, primarily Sub-Saharan Africa, which I fell in love with, and still to this day try to go as often as I can, usually to Southern African countries. Most of my time in the Foreign Service was West Africa and Central Africa, with a posting also in Djibouti. And then my final posting was Tbilisi in Georgia. Then I came back to safe Washington, D.C., and went back to working with nonprofits. I was with a healthcare foundation initially for 7.5 years, so I was on the grant-making side. Then I went on for 23 years as an executive director. I'm still an executive director. I've been with 4 different organizations: healthcare, workforce development technology, arts, and now youth education. Along the way there, I began teaching a lot of nonprofit classes, and I teach 3 different certificate in nonprofit management and leadership programs, 2 in the DC area and 1 in Denver. I also do a fair amount of consulting, primarily grant writing and board development. As far as Giving Circles, when I was getting my master's at UIPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, I focused on Giving Circles. So at that point, they'd been around about 15 years maybe. And I personally joined my first Giving Circle in 2006. And since then, have kind of kept up a portfolio of membership and giving circles. I like to call what I call the traditional ones, where everybody gives X amount of money. They're a member, they get one vote. But then I'm in another giving circle that's far more relaxed, not even a 501c3. And then I'm in a larger one that gives away a lot of money, but every member doesn't get a vote. And that's international, which I also like. In 2016, I had the opportunity to go to a Gates Foundation Summit for Giving Circles in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I came away amazed. I just had no idea there was so much out there as far as giving circles. So then I, with Bob Wittig, started the DMV Collective Giving Network with an effort to kind of bring different giving circles together. That same year, I remember I'd been approached by a Washington Post author, or columnist, who wanted to do a paragraph on giving circles. And I'm like, no, 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 no. And so I started to quantify out the number of giving circles, the number of members, and ultimately they did a page and a half piece with photos because they decided giving circles were predominant, were quite a presence in the DC area. And so here I am today, and I'll turn it over to Peter, I think.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you.
I feel like every time we talk, I learn something new about you. So so my name is Peter Williamson. I like to introduce myself with sort of the Monty Python and now for something completely different preface. It's a very kind of non-linear story on the surface, but I am a part of a 6th generation family foundation. So that's sort of my anchor point in philanthropy, and also kind of how I've gotten into this world of giving and thinking about how giving can be a really meaningful part of your life. I studied architecture and geography in school, so I've always been very interested in designing kind of places and spaces that make people think, and giving is one of those things. I graduated from Dartmouth in 2012 and had a childhood dream of being a professional golfer, and pursued that dream after school for about 5 years, traveling around the world and kind of seeing different cultures and areas through the lens of play. And today, I took a step back about 5 years ago from my professional golf career and started a nonprofit called Game Genius here in the Washington, D.C. area that helps other nonprofits tell their story through games. And it's another kind of form of philanthropy or way of trying to help nonprofits fundraise and appeal to folks that enjoy whatever mission they're working on. Kind of through that journey, I've been introduced to a lot of folks in the DMV area, like Lynn, thinking about how to both disrupt and challenge kind of the norms of philanthropy. I helped launch a giving circle for kind of a next gen audience in the region. We sort of defined next gen as if you feel like you're next gen, you are. There wasn't really an age barrier at all to it. But the goal was really to build a bridge for folks that don't typically have either the resources or the sort of capacity to think about themselves as a philanthropist. We found that a lot of the giving circles in the region were skewing older. And I think having a younger audience crowd was helpful to kind of create a peer group that people felt comfortable joining. So we started that about 4 years ago. Perfect timing, right when the pandemic hit. And so we've done a lot of work trying to figure out how to build community virtually. And it's been both a meaningful experience as someone who's a part of a family foundation, has seen philanthropy institutional level, to do something a little bit more grassroots and on the ground, and happy to share a little bit more about that experience.
A professional golfer and a diplomat. Terrific.
That's why we're here talking about philanthropy.
Welcome to Giving Circles.
There are a lot of different kinds of folks that participate in giving circles, as Lynn mentioned. I had a follow up for Lynn. You mentioned that you went to a Gates funded summit about giving circles.
A Gates Foundation Summit. Yeah.
I hosted it.
That was their goal was to bring together, I believe, 25 of the largest giving circle networks in the nation. And they had two representatives basically for each one. And it was to share information to try to make the whole movement stronger.
What would, so it's curious to me that it's Gates, what would Gates Foundation, what would their interest in giving circles be? 'Cause that's
They
quite
had
a
had
different approach.
quite a large interest in it from the concept of how do they, their role in democratizing philanthropy and taking philanthropy everywhere to get everyone engaged. So it has been an interest for quite a while.
And when was that you attended that?
My memory gets foggy, but I think about 2016, I believe,
Okay.
in March
Approximately.
2016, exactly, I believe.
Sure. Very interesting. So, thank you for those introductions and for your time. You've been very generous with your time in the past and coming back. I have some questions here. I'm going to try to stick to them. So again, Lynn first. Straightforward question. What are the pros and cons of giving circles as vehicles? Feel free to do one pro, one con, but right, if you're desperate to add a second pro or second con, go for it.
Okay.
At least one pro and at least one con, though.
I'll start out with one each because I don't want to. I want to give Peter something to say.
Leave some material left, right? Sure.
So pro, there's a lot of them. I mean, giving circles. 2022 data showed there were more than 2,000 giving circles in the United States. Over 150,000 people were in them, and most importantly, in 2022, they gave away $1.3 billion. So, I mean, they're a presence. Certainly, they have cons. The hardest or the most difficult con I see, which we're going to talk about more later, is the concept of succession planning. Typically, the leaders of giving circles are volunteer, and they don't want to do it for 80 years or 20 years even, or 30 years. And that's a big challenge, how to bring in new leadership.
Yes, and we will. That is a question
Yeah, we'll
coming up.
talk more
Thank you
later.
for reading the questions in advance. We'll dive more into that later. But Peter, a pro and a con.
Yeah, I'll go the opposite way. So I kind of building on Lynn's talk about succession planning. I think one of the most difficult things about giving circles is once you get kind of start to create a process, you recognize how much work it is to do it well. And as sort of a big believer of quality, creating a process where you're giving, being transparent, kind of being at the front edge of philanthropy, if that's one of your main kind of goals, is to learn through this process. There's a lot of administrative work to it. I don't know if all giving circles start with the understanding of how much work it takes. And so as a result, as Lynn was mentioning, kind of succession planning is challenging because oftentimes the founder of a giving circle or kind of core group that started it, they'll start to fade away over time. And if they don't have other people who are willing to kind of run forward with the idea, giving circles often either slow down or close down. And we will talk a little bit more about that later. On the pro side, it's incredibly accessible. I think the whole concept of giving people a vehicle to create a pool of funds that they can give to their community is something that's existed for a very, very long time. It just kind of shows itself in different forms. And it seems that giving circles is kind of one of those things that's really sticky for people. But whether it's, affinity groups that are collecting money to fundraising for nonprofits, I mean, there are different forms of this that exist kind of all around. And I think giving circles have given people the confidence to start something with a small group. And if it grows, great, but there's no pressure to necessarily do that. It's not an institution like a big foundation. And so it doesn't necessarily need all of the governance pieces. That being said, it can be helpful to have some things in place in order to keep it going.
So we have a question for the crowd from Amit. She told me how to pronounce it in the other session. I think I got that right. But her question is very similar to to one we've got coming up, so I'll ask them both. Hers is, what is the advice you would give a nonprofit for approaching giving circles, particularly for a young nonprofit? And I personally, what my big pro for giving circles would be that they are ideal for funding young nonprofits. It's one of the better suited vehicles, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. My question, quite similar. Great minds think alike. Amit. In addition, but I know a little bit more about our guests. So, in addition to granting through giving circles, you both also raised money for nonprofits. How would you say the tactics differ for fundraisers when approaching a giving circle than with a foundation or other organized grant maker? I'd love to hear from both of you on that.
I always tell people who ask me this question, and that I believe as a nonprofit fundraiser as well, it is actually harder to get money from giving circles than it can be other funders. Because most foundations, not all, but most are going to have some structure in place. It's going to be a few people, they follow that structure. Whereas with giving circles, even if you have the original founders, you're going to have different members, you're going to have different leaders within the giving circle. And it seems like that the processes may change more, and also you're pleasing many more people, perhaps, than you might be if you were just sending in your proposal to X foundation with 4 trustees or 30 trustees. So you've got to be willing to study the giving circle. My approach, for better or for worse, I usually try to get to know some of the members, attend their events, and then when I'm actually writing a request to a giving circle, I try to find ways for engagement in their members. Usually the giving circles do want to have some way their members can actually actively engage and hear from the organization. So that takes some creativity. I was just working on an application to Giving Circle about 2 weeks ago. And, we were figuring it out, and we came up with, we do a fundraising drive for X, and then we do an event where the Giving Circle members can do activities. And then we'll also have the Giving Circle members writing personal handwritten cards to the clients and putting in clever stickers. So it's almost a menu of options there for the giving circle when they look at how to engage.
Yeah, I just sort of adding on, I am a big believer that kind of every giving entity has positioned themselves in the world of philanthropy somewhere, and giving circles are somewhere near kind of that entry level bottom, right? There are certainly giving circles out there that give hundreds of thousands of dollars away and at one time, but most of the giving circles are giving hundreds, thousands of dollars, right? And so you're talking about impactful gifts that are going to help smaller nonprofits. We at the Next Gen Giving Circle very much kind of prided ourselves on being that first grant that a nonprofit could get that they could leverage into another grant. And so knowing that that was sort of how we positioned ourselves, it's really helpful to know that as a nonprofit, right? If you're a small nonprofit and you've gotten a bunch of institutional grants before, you're going to look really good to members, and members might vote you up. But if your budget has kind of grown to an extent that it sort of dwarfs everything else, or other applicants in the pool, you may actually kind of fall out of favor with the goal of the grant cycle. And so just understanding where the giving circle is trying to position itself is really beneficial for any applicant. On the other side of the coin, a lot of giving circles don't necessarily have that mission or goal in place. And so I think it's been really great being a part of a network like the DMV Giving Circle Network that Lynn helped start, because we've got a community of giving circles that can share best practices and applicants with each other. And so understanding if there are networks involved with giving circles in your area, you should leverage that to the most of your ability, right? Figure out what other giving circles are connected to each other, so that you're only applying one or a couple times instead of 20 different times, knowing that a lot of them are focused in the same region.
I had a boss, one of my first bosses in fundraising, gave me some advice. We had been at this point in my career, I had been only doing like grants from individuals and foundations. And at this point, we were raising money from Congress And my boss had done that before, and I asked him like, "What's the difference?" He's like, "It's not different. There's a group of people, right? And they have that group of people. Every group of people has a different group dynamic. Congress is no different from a family foundation board, from a giving circle, from anything else. They have a group dynamic that you need to figure out, right? And in particular, there's a day and time where they will meet and decide who to give the grant to. You want to do everything you can to be well positioned on that day. And the creative professional fundraiser will figure out many ways to be well positioned on that day, including like making sure you know folks that are going to be in the room. I think that's probably the best way to get a grant from a giving circle, is to have somebody who's a member of the circle championing your proposal in the room on that day. But that's also true for like getting funding from Congress or getting a grant from a foundation. To really get like having somebody who's in the room that day championing is going to get you that funding. So I have a follow up for Peter on that, right? And this is sort of tied to the secession issue, right? Giving circles are hard to like keep going around because it's volunteers, right? But that is also true for family foundations, right? It's your sixth generation, decades long serving family foundation is, like I said, like made up of people who meet on a day and right, make a decision, and they are and almost entirely volunteers, right? Is it the connection to family that keeps that going for so long?
I'd like to think so. We certainly, our family foundation has been really strong in cultivating relationships and kind of a community. As a foundation or group grows, I think as any group grows, it becomes harder and harder to maintain that many connections, right? I think there are a bunch of things out there that say like there are only so many people that you can be best friends with or really well acquainted with. There are some cousins in my family that I know by name, but I don't know as well as I used, to know kind of the closer people that we worked with 10, 12 years ago. And so as the group grows, it becomes a little bit more difficult to get everyone in the same room. And so I think you have to adapt a bit around, how are you conducting business? How are you giving people different angles of getting involved so that they can find meaning in the process? I think as a family foundation, one of our main goals is really to empower the younger generation to feel like they can go into their own communities and engage with other forms of philanthropy. So for me, that was starting a giving circle to kind of see it from grassroots. For others, it's, directing grants at more of a kind of like one-on-one capacity. For others, it's sitting on a committee and reviewing proposals that come into the family. And so thinking about how you can open up those different pockets has been really helpful for us in thinking about engaging more people. I think on the giving circle side, there are opportunities to do that, but there are only so many funds to give, right? A family foundation is working off of more or less of an endowment, which is getting invested in this, creating a cycle every year where you give 5% of that fund or more if you're progressive. But giving circles are often giving away almost all, if not all, of their funds in a current year. So like if we raise $50,000, we're giving away $50,000, right? We're not going to hold $10,000 and invest it unless we really have a vision for becoming a bigger institution.
Is that part of the definition of it? Because you're right. I've never really thought about it. I picture a giving circle as we all put our money in and we're going to give all of that money away as grants this round. I suppose a giving circle could operate off of an endowment, right? Like that's good. That's really hard to distinguish from a foundation.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah.
What's different about that? And that's I'll just dive into my next question here, and you can sort of talk about all of that. Your answers be as broad as you want. But I've been hearing for a long time from a bunch of different organizations and individuals that giving circles somehow democratize philanthropy. I think that's probably 90% of the time I've heard the word democratize. It has been somebody telling me that it's giving circles doing it to philanthropy. Why would giving circles do this to philanthropy? And what does it mean? Lynn, why don't you go ahead?
It means that any one individual can suddenly feel like they're going to have impact. I remain amazed at seeing the pride and the excitement in someone's eye who's new to a giving circle, and they give them the first grants, and they're like, I was part of that $5,000 or $50,000 or $100,000 grant. So it really gets people excited about philanthropy, and they do feel like they have a seat at the table. Also, thankfully, because we have so many giving circles now, I believe there is a giving circle for everyone, whether it's someone who just wants to give their $25,000 and not do anything, or whether it's someone else who wants to give $1 a day and actively engage. There is that giving circle there for them.
Yeah, and I use the word as a pro accessibility, kind of similar idea.
Do you both say is democracy? Do you say democratize?
I have used the word, though I do feel like it doesn't necessarily resonate with everyone. So I think, thinking about accessibility and giving everyone the opportunity to join and find meaning in giving is sort of what I at least mean by democratize. I think when I consider my experience, not everyone is born into a 6th generation family foundation, right? That's not very democratic. That's, a part of a larger system. And I've been generally critical of a group that is just sort of like given a pot of money to give away. Like there's no, like, who am I to give those dollars away, right? And you grapple with that a lot when you're sort of put into a position. And I think giving circles offer the opportunity to be in that giving vehicle kind of more by choice, right? And I think that's a really powerful difference between sort of being part or born into one versus actually starting and being a part of one. I think you can oftentimes be a little bit more nimble when you have chosen to be a part of a network like that. Whereas an institution that, has a history of doing things is a little harder to change. It's kind of like a, tanker ship in the ocean. Governance to philanthropy, it's challenging to move and change and when you want to.
Mm-hmm. So I've got, we'll get to we've alluded to this question before. I realize now this is a long one. I'm just going to try to read the whole thing. Took up half the page, the whole bottom half of the page here. I'm gonna do my best. I have a theater degree, so I think I can handle this. So giving circles do not always last. One of our board members, Lana, was the former board member, was the executive director of something called Giving Circles Fund, which no longer operates as a nonprofit. An organization I helped to found, the Slingshot Fund, still exists, but no longer runs the Giving Circle part of it. A co-review partner that we had, Circle for Justice Innovations, was a Giving Circle for a few decades. They hung in there for a long time, but they are now like 3 or 4 different Giving Circles with different names, mostly just because of some disagreements amongst the original leadership, right? So, of course, this can happen with other kinds of foundations and grant makers as well. Corporate programs are a little flighty. They don't necessarily come back the next year. But like, it does seem to me, from my perspective, that giving circles are slightly less permanent than foundations, who are called, to be fair, are called foundations. So they're really like leaning in on the permanence part there, right? But how does the world of philanthropy grapple with the relative impermanence of thousands of giving circles?
I think it's a great thing, actually. I mean, it's taken me a few years to get around to this, but yes, I think existing for a while is okay, and then closing your doors. I'll use the example of Giving Circle of Hope in Northern Virginia. They were in existence 17 years. At the end, again, a succession planning issue, they didn't have members who wished to engage as leadership and really take on the jobs, but they did a huge celebration. They did have an endowment, and they were able actually to disperse those funds too, with agreement, of course, from the original donors. But they, 17 years, they gave away 173 grants to 69 nonprofits, totaling $1.4 million in Northern Virginia. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Very well done. The other thing about the succession planning and the closing of giving circles is I always wonder about the trickle effect. From the Giving Circle of Hope closing, 3 other newer, each different Giving Circles were created because after that closed, individual wanted to do other things. So I think it's okay. It's part of the whole landscape of philanthropy.
Yeah, agreed. I think, you know, a lot of people, at least in the networks that I've been a part of, joining giving circles, are trying to learn about the process of philanthropy through the giving circle, right? So just by virtue of thinking about it as kind of like an educational vehicle, it's going to have its time where it's helpful for someone. And I think as people grow and learn together, they're going to be at different parts of that journey. And if the leaders of the organization have kind of gotten everything that they can out of it, and there isn't someone behind them to step in and take over the organization, it may be better to sort of close down, celebrate what you've done together, and let other people from the giving circle kind of start their own pockets. You know, it's an iterative process that I think can be really healthy for philanthropy. It also kind of gets at is a Meet's question earlier, which is, you know, how do you approach a giving circle that is impermanent, right? Because if you're trying to build these relationships and you're going to spend all this time trying to learn about an individual or a couple people who are in the circle to kind of get in the inside, and then it closes 3 or 4 years later, that can feel like you're just always trying to get through a revolving door, and it can be really challenging. And so I think the more a giving circle can be transparent about kind of its goals and its plans, the better. A kind of a story about the Next Gen Giving Circle: in the last year, we've transitioned from being sort of a you know, co-founder operated volunteer enterprise, right, where it was a handful of us that were a part of an executive committee that that operated the whole thing. We transitioned our administrative pieces to a local nonprofit called the Catalog for Philanthropy, and it's now an initiative under that nonprofit. And so we'll see how this kind of experiment plays out, but we're really excited because it allows us to take some of that administrative burden on the giving circle and move it to a nonprofit whose mission is to kind of like catalyze philanthropy in the region. And so thinking about how, you know, younger donors and people in the next gen space fit into that mission, it was a really nice fit. And so if giving circles have kind of that offload that they can find in their own community, whether it's a community foundation or another nonprofit that's looking to kind of fit that puzzle piece, that may be an option for some to think about how a giving circle can continue its practice, because we do feel like the need is being served, but the amount of effort that can be put into it from some folks is starting to wane.
Yes. So the just a real risk of the impermanence, something that I've seen up close a few times through Unfunded Lists, also at Slingshot Fund and some other places, right? Is right, some first time philanthropists get very excited and give a grant to an organization, and that's their first grant, and all of that excitement happens that we mentioned, and it is terrific. And maybe they even get a grant the next year from that same circle. But like eventually, that circle stops giving grants, and that organization never really, like, sometimes these are like really small, tiny little groups. When I was at Slingshot Fund, we gave $50,000 grants one time, like a few times. That was to basically completely unfunded groups. So all of a sudden, here's $50,000. And now, right, they can't get that from that source anymore. And generally, when you're a fundraiser, the rule of thumb is if you get a gift from somebody, you should start coming up with a year-long plan to get another gift from them, hopefully a little bit larger, right? So that's like, and I've seen organizations go away, like, or have to often have to like become part of another nonprofit or something like that when that happens. But there is a lot of other philanthropy to fill in, right? And I think it's the responsibility of those organizations. Once you get a Giving Circle grant, be aware of that and try to help find other funders. And Giving Circles can play a role in that too, helping with their capacity building and such.
And Dave, one thing I found as a nonprofit seeking Giving Circle money is almost 100% of the time, I have then started getting money from the individual members. And I usually find that a fair number of the members of giving circles have their own foundations. So it's not
Sure.
necessarily a totally closed door. I mean, that door
No.
closes, but others hopefully open because of the relationship.
Yes, I suppose where there is risk, there is also potential.
Yeah.
Right. But again, it depends on how, like, some giving circles, you're right, are made up of people who are on the boards and foundations, right? Others, the ones that are democratizing philanthropy the most, aren't going to be made up of most of those sorts of connections, right? But brings me to, right, I think unfunded lists can help out with this situation. Brings me to my next question, which is somewhat long, but not as long as the last. So Peter, you've been on both sides of a couple of our co-review partnerships. So and just to quickly summarize co-review, that's where Unfunded List offers to independently review a bunch of submissions to a program. So one time we did this with one of the committees at Kettering. I think it was called something very nebulous. It's like called the Human Committee. Is that right?
The Human Services Committee.
Human Services Committee.
The grab bag of all committees. Yes.
It gets to the Human Fund.
Mm-hmm.
Giving for Humans. It was a lot of arts groups and community-focused organizations, and it was a really cool batch of groups to review. And actually, some of those folks have attended the symposium this week. Welcome back. And but you've also worked out a partnership with your Giving Circle, right? So we reviewed proposals there. Lynn has been a consistent advisor and evaluator. You participated in a number of evaluation rounds, including several proposals that were originally submitted to Giving Circles, right? I personally think that co-review partnerships provide great value to any kind of giving program. But what are some of the unique advantages for Giving Circles if they choose to co-review with Unfunded List? Let's go with Peter first this time.
Yeah, so I can share sort of both sides of it, given that we have kind of two different experiences. One of the things that I've always found helpful in basically doing anything is getting candid feedback, right? And oftentimes in philanthropy, when you're applying, there either isn't a promise or it's really hard for an entity to promise feedback just because either their systems aren't as robust as you think they are, right? Oftentimes it's like four people sitting on a couch, like trying to figure out where to give money away. And or there's some kind of legal liability they don't want to come back and hit them, right? People aren't well versed enough to give an answer that doesn't have repercussions. And so they just kind of put the door in everyone's face and say, like, we're just going to say thank you for applying, but it was a competitive cycle. Like, you've seen this in a lot of different spaces, right? Whether you're applying to school or applying to a job or applying for a grant, oftentimes you'll just get this like regular declination letter, and it doesn't really help anybody because they're oftentimes guessing what they did wrong. And so I think I've seen over the last 5 years, a lot more giving entities offer either some form of conversation, some kind of feedback, but it's not as candid. It usually is somewhat canned in doing that. And so when I think of the Unfunded List and its value to the sector, to be able to get kind of unfiltered views of how people read your proposal can give you the content or feedback you need to improve it. And I think about that being so valuable in so many different spaces. For a giving circle, oftentimes that can help a small nonprofit across all of its grant applications to different entities, right? Oh, we keep saying this phrase, but it's not resonating with anybody. And so let's shift it a little bit and maybe we'll see more success. At a foundational level, same idea, but you're also starting to hear back from people who are connected in that space and know what kinds of terminology and what kinds of words will resonate with people reviewing at different levels of philanthropy. And so I think just understanding, what kind of feedback giving groups can give and how much more something like Unfunded List can give will show you why it's so important. So always encourage people to do it at least once and kind of apply to you're going to use unfunded list or use some kind of feedback program as a way to support your applicants in more ways than just the dollar.
Yes, excellent, thank you. So Lynn, the same question to you, but I want to add an extra filter in there. You mentioned earlier you were involved in a giving circle that focused on international organizations.
Yes.
We've done quite a bit of co-review partnerships with groups accepting international applicants. That adds sort of a cross-cultural, like philanthropy is already confusing, right? You add in the cross-cultural element, and sort of often extra confusing for these folks. So can you talk a little bit about I did your giving circle experience, giving internationally, right? And then also how like co-review can be helpful there with international applicants, including ESL applicants and folks that might not speak the language well.
Giving internationally is significantly more difficult than giving domestically. I started out actually when I was with the Healthcare Foundation, we were international, and I was there before and after 9/11. And so the way the laws changed in America really made the whole international giving just much more legal. There was a lot of legal sides to it. You know, you had your board members had to be vetted to make sure they weren't terrorists. Heaven forbid, Lynn O'Connell is an Irish name. That's a very bad thing because and then rules about which countries and how the money could be given. And so that was very challenging. Now, the giving circle I'm with now, we only give to organizations that are 501c3s in the United States, and that makes it easier. But you're right, for the applicants, it is a huge challenge. We do require the applications to be in English simply because we can't all read all the languages in the world, and we require the budgets to be in dollars. Very challenging, and we recognize that. But again, dealing with that is something at this moment we aren't able to do more. Hopefully someday we'll be able to surpass those barriers. I'm a big proponent of certainly larger giving circles using co-review for different reasons than Peter, though, interestingly enough. I simply think that grant making is a huge amount of work. For example, with the International Giving Circle, I'm with, per the job description, when I was on the grant review team, we were to give 20 hours a week, year round, to reviewing. We met every Wednesday night, even the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, virtually via Zoom, to do our work. So huge amount of work there. And you think about the administrative time as well as the volunteer time. Might it not just be better to go with co-review, which is a system that is set up, that are experts, unbiased, ready to go? The other advantage, and this may only be in some of my giving circles that I've encountered, but the whole technology. Is the giving circle going to buy their own technology? If so, which are they going to buy? And then, of course, how are you going to get all the giving circle members, or at least those on the grant making committee, up to speed on how to use that technology? So, you know, really a giving circle might be able to give out more money if they simply paid to have a co-review and devoted their resources to other activities.
Perhaps, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. It's probably true.
Yeah.
A huge advantage for me, this is from my experience reviewing giving circle applications. And this is pretty much any application. This happens in the follow-up conversations we have. They're probably going to apply for something else. That's probably not the last grant. And with the giving circle, it's almost certainly going to be a different kind of funding. It's not, I think it would be a bad idea to have all of your funding come from giving circles. You could do it, you can do it, right? But because of their impermanence, it would mean you'd be like constantly hustling, I think, right? So, and a lot of those folks, like you meant, like have happened in both of our experience, you might then apply to the more official foundation of one of the giving circle's members, and then have to write a family foundation proposal, which is very similar to giving circle applications, but different. Like in unique ways. Every foundation is just a little bit different, right? And so being able to talk through that, folks, with them after their application, whether or not they got the grant from the giving circle, as they continue other sources. We've seen that be very helpful for folks. And when I'm talking to them, I'm armed with feedback from great folks like you. So we're agreed every Giving Circle should co-review with us.
I didn't say every.
Probably not every. I can't do that. Someday maybe, but no, not all of them. I have I have a follow-up for Lynn, and then a final question. So you mentioned earlier you came prepared with a lot of good numbers. Only 30,000 nonprofits when you started. It's a lot now, right? You know how many Giving Circles there are, right? I wonder, like, so one, how do they count Giving Circles? Because if I think there's probably a lot of uncounted circles.
And it goes both ways. It's interesting. Yeah, you make a good point. I think there's probably more than 2,000 out there because a lot of them aren't counted. You have many that are just people coming together, throwing money in a hat and giving it out. And they may not even yet have heard the term Giving Circle. You know, I'm fascinated whenever I'm teaching my nonprofit classes, I'll say to my students, who's heard of a Giving Circle? And almost never does a hand go up. And these are people in the philanthropy space, you know, so it's not a common term. On the other hand, I think we have an issue, certainly post-pandemic, which is not surprising. There are many Giving Circles in the books that are basically dormant or inactive and not giving money. So it's really tough because the IRS does not have a definition of Giving Circle to know what is a Giving Circle out there. And then, of course, we don't have time today and an hour conversation to get in the debate. Is Giving Circle a good word to use? Not everybody likes the Giving Circle word, the phrase.
I've never actually sat in a circle while participating in one. We had a rectangular table. And like when I was doing it with the youth, they would usually be like in rows, like in a classroom or something.
I think Lynn brings up a good point though, and it kind of speaks to, I think, the movement as a whole. Giving Circles are one form of what I think is being dubbed the collective giving movement. And it really is where like a bunch of people are coming together and pooling their dollars so that they can give larger amounts, right? That it comes in so many different forms, right? We're seeing it in mutual aid networks. We're seeing it in, employees pooling dollars to support employees that are having hard times, right? We're seeing it in just different formats. You may or may not get a tax deduction for being a part of it. But I don't think that's necessarily the point of all collective giving.
They're nice. I mean, it's nice when you can get them. So in addition to co-reviewing with your Giving Circles, what is next for Giving Circles? The title of the session is 2023 and beyond, right? And I'll add I'm not exactly a spring chicken. And it does seem that there's a circular nature to the Giving Circle conversation. I think it's possible Gates has had that summit like every 6 years for a little while or some version of it. I did notice the We Give Summit, which is a cool series of events that folks should check out going on this month. But if you look at who's funding it, it's big time. Some of the big time funders that like tried to push it previously. As I mentioned, we had the Giving Circles Fund existed from like 2010 to 2014 and had more or less the same mission as Philanthropy Together, which was founded in 2015, right afterwards, right? And I just, it seems, and before that, I was doing Slingshot Fund, and we were talking about Giving Circles and using the word democratize and all of that. So look, and we've talked about the pros of that today, and I do think they outweigh the cons. But like, what's next? What's the next step for the collective giving? If it's a movement, you gotta move somewhere, right?
Just what you mentioned in the We Give Summit. I think groups like Philanthropy Together, just kind of the host of that event, are kind of at the front edge of the movement. They're trying to figure out how can we support collective giving in different ways, and they've created partnerships with groups like Grapevine, which is kind of a collection service to be able to kind of deal with the administrative burden of Giving Circles. I think there are more technology solutions that can help Giving Circles move more nimbly. I think it can take away some of that pressure point that ends up closing down a circle or creates enough of a burnout that it has to go away. Um, I'm excited just because I think there are enough people that have been exposed to it that they've learned something from their first or handful of experiences that they've had, and that people are iterating upon that. As long as there are people that are taking something away from the process of either starting or being a part of a giving circle, I think you'll see improvement in the space. It's always going to be challenging with the permanence of a giving circle, but I do think there are a lot of conversations out there that are saying, it's the goal is not necessarily to live forever. The goal is to kind of serve its purpose, and you need to define that purpose. And people are getting more and more into that, especially around some of the conversations and DEI spaces and things like that. Those kinds of conversations have a lot of similarities, and from the standpoint of just creating something really meaningful, equitable, inclusive.
Great. Lynn, what does the future behold?
And I'm sort of curious, the whole concept of democratizing philanthropy and all that is happening in the world right now and people's opinions on it all. What we've started to see is we have a few giving circles across the country now, none locally to my knowledge here in the DC area, but anyway, that are beginning to focus on advocacy and sort of state political campaigns that are giving to that. And it's going to be curious to see if that trend continues. I mean, could giving circles be a way for your average citizen to engage, learn more, ask more questions, and begin to make changes, not just in the nonprofit sector, but within their local, certainly their local communities?
Yes, more money in politics. Terrific idea. No, but it's a way to they can balance the scales in certain spaces. We might as well talk about that a little bit. Like we've been focusing mostly on the idea of giving circles giving to nonprofits, but there are arguably have been giving circles focused on what you're talking about
Yeah.
for a long time, right? Like what are those secret like cigar smoking dudes in the back room, right? If not a giving circle of some kind, choosing which candidates to financially support, which and like there have been various. Sometimes they call it a machine, right? The whatever machine, political machines, right? And that's they choose you. That's what getting an endorsement means. Is not just getting right gifts from the donors in that circle, but also like you get access to the email list, right? So you can contact a very large circle of donors very quickly, right? So what you and you just mentioned it, so I'm just thinking about this now. What do you think about giving circles, like focusing on candidates, or is that a part of the world that the collective giving movement should maybe steer clear of?
I don't have an opinion on it. I mean, every giving circle is different. One giving circle, one. So, um, every giving circle is going to choose their own mode of operation and their own things that they are interested in supporting, which is the beauty of it all.
Well said. And that is our, democracy in action, I suppose. The what was it? De Tocqueville said that our greatest strength was our voluntary associations. The fact that Americans would come together and voluntarily associate to make social change was somewhat unprecedented in the history of the world. Generally, change came from right kings and tyrants and other awful people imposing it on folks. Right, the ability of us to be is fundamentally democratic. So while I may have made fun of the buzzword a little bit, I think it's quite true. I think it's democracy is messy, and that's what that is. Thank you very much for the conversation. We've taken up nearly most of the time. If there are questions from the crowd, feel free to chime in there. But in the meantime, Peter, do you have any closing comments?
I don't. I think it was a good conversation, and I think covers kind of the breadth of giving circles and collective giving. I always encourage people to, if they haven't been a part of a giving circle, to find something that resonates with them, or to get involved with something like the Unfunded List. It's a way to see philanthropy from a couple of different angles, and I think the more you see it, the more helpful you can be with people in your network, but also understand how the system works. It's a big, complicated, sometimes ugly system, and being able to navigate it takes time and perspective.
Well said. Lynn?
I would just echo basically what Peter said. I encourage everyone, if it's right for them, to consider looking at giving circles if they're interested in philanthropy. It's one of the best ways to learn and see both sides, that of the grantee and the grant maker.
Very good. Thank you both for your service to the symposium and fundraisers and the philanthropy world, and Lynn to the U.S. State Department, Peter to the world of competitive golf. Were you a consular officer?
No, I was an economic officer.
Oh, if you were, you could be the pro and the consular officer. So maybe it's not too late. You can still take a test. Right, then I'll be able to make that joke, and it'll be worth it. Thank you very much. This has been the final session of the symposium. I think it went great. We had a lot of fun chats about trendy topics like giving circles. The AI conversation was pretty cool. We talked about rural philanthropy, had a Q&A, had great feedback on the feedback session. Generally talked about grants in pretty much every session. If you're an evaluator, and most of you are, you have until May 20th to do your reviews. Please do them. If you want to do extra reviews, great. Do extra reviews. We're providing perspective to proposal authors so that they can move forward and apply to giving circles, foundations, you name it. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, David Jaffe, for the recording. Thank you, Margaret Chapman, our board chair, for help organizing. Thank you to our entire host committee and all of our guests and speakers. Have a great weekend, and good luck with your funding and your grant making. Goodbye, everybody.